Okay, so it's right up at 12 now. So I wanted to welcome everybody. This is the Duke Center on Addiction and Behavior Change, CABC, a part of DIBS, and this is our last seminar of the spring semester. So welcome. And before we do some introductory material and introduce today's speaker, I would like to look ahead to the fall. So after all of your exciting summer events, research and clinical work, and possibly some vacation, I hope, we're going to reconvene on August 25th, and Dr. Chang-Shan Li from Yale University is going to be talking to us about chronic cocaine craving and the involvement of cue, elicited stress, and reward responses. And then we're going to continue on through the semester on about 2 or 3 times per month. I just wanted to point out as a feature, we're having a series of Duke nicotine research series of seminars. This is kind of a echo of the Duke Nicotine Research Conference that we've had for 25 years or so. That was interrupted recently by COVID, and we're kind of getting back into it with this extended seminar series. We are planning actually for the spring of 2022 a research symposium on cannabis legalization and how to cope with that changing landscape. Now I wanted to hand it off to Nicole Schramm-Cepeda for a minute. She wanted to speak about the House bill that's pending.
Yeah, I just wanted to give everybody a heads up that I'll be sending around an email in the next couple of days about Senate Bill 607 that's going through the North Carolina State House. This is a bill that's designed to greatly roll back needle exchange programs and place a lot of administrative burden on them that will mostly wipe them out of the state of North Carolina. And there's pretty broad coalition moving to educate our state legislatures of how harmful this would be. And I've been working with Doug Herron, who's our Duke's liaison to the state legislature, to draft a letter. There's a clinical group that is sending a letter, and I'm drafting one for our research group. And so I'll send it around. I'll send the background explanation of why this is coming up. And if you're inclined to sign on to a letter that will go up from Duke, please do so, but I'll send around more details.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. And this is very, very important in terms of the work that we do, and to make it so that it actually has lasting impacts in the community. So to be involved with both the kind of research and the clinical work and also the policy initiatives. Okay, so now it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Isaac Lipkus, who is a professor here at Duke in the School of Nursing. And Isaac's been here for some time. He's been involved with Duke for, I believe, 26 years or so, last 13 in the School of Nursing, and has earned his PhD and master's at our sister institution down the road here, 15501 at UNC Chapel Hill. And he does research on tobacco, and has done some work with marijuana as well, and particularly people's perceptions of risk and their reactions to that, and health warnings. And today he's going to speak to us about his research and perceived risks of water pipe tobacco smoking among young adults. Isaac?
All right, well, thank you so much for allowing me to give a presentation on some of the research my colleagues and I have done throughout the years. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get through 4 different studies and present some select data from each that concerns how young adults view the risk of hookah, in other words, water pipe tobacco. This first slide just shows a hookah apparatus with 2 youths actually smoking water pipe tobacco. And the reason this is an important slide is not only to show you the apparatus, which can be very ornate and very, very pretty aesthetically, but it's also a very social habit. And probably this is one of the ways that smoking hookah is a little bit different than other tobacco products, also including vaping, in that it's highly social. Most of the time people do it with other individuals. So what I want to do is, let's see if I could uh-oh, why am I not moving my next slide here? Okay, there we go. All right, so what I want to do is just give you a sense of how common water pipe tobacco is with respect to the number of people, the proportion of people who smoke it within the last day, and kind of compare it with two common tobacco products or what we consider tobacco-related products that often are used in youth. So if we look at the data from the Monitoring the Future study, which is a nationally representative sample of 8th, 10th, 12th-year-olds, and then now adults of varied illicit products and tobacco products, what we see here is that among adults, the prevalence rate for the last 30-day use is about nearly 5%. With college students, it goes up a little bit. And for 12th graders, it's 4%. But what you can see is from 12th graders, it goes up when they go into college, or they go just to transition into young adulthood. So there is an increase that we are expecting to get from people who are in the 12th grade. And if you compare that to cigarettes and vaping, what we see is that water pipe tobacco is actually less prevalent than these other two products. And by the way, these are 2019 statistics, and some of these statistics I found today actually are a little bit down by about half the amount for, like, for example, vaping and to some degree cigarettes. But you might say, well, Isaac, why are you studying a product that has substantially, so to speak, lower prevalence rates in terms of recent use compared to these others? And the reason is that water pipe tobacco, if used, is actually just as harmful, if not more harmful, than cigarette use. And it's also a product that has not been the focus very much at all in terms of how to prevent people from acquiring it and using it, and also with respect to cessation. So that's why I think it's an important product. And in fact, I'll be showing you some information about the health risks of smoking hookah. So you could say, well, what are the various factors that seem to promote the use of water pipe tobacco in young adults and maybe even those who are younger? There's several main themes that seem to emerge. One of them is there's a lack of, at least today, of substantial regulatory policies that affect hookah use. So that's more forthcoming. There is now this notion that we have to put in a warning that hookah is addictive and see what the effects of that is. Although we know that those kinds of messages do very little in terms of deterring use. The other thing, as with like vaping products and so forth, it is a product that has flavored tobacco, which is very appealing to different youth. There is a fair amount of advertisements that surround hookah tobacco use, and it's also a product that you could actually get in various localities, such as hookah bars and cafes, where people sit around, they order the type of tobacco, and they sit around and smoke the product. And related to that, therefore, is that it's really an appealing social activity where people go around, they smoke the hookah, and they socialize on talking about whatever they want. And I think the other one that's really important and what I'm going to focus on today is that water pipe tobacco is viewed as less addictive and safer than cigarettes, which everybody, generally speaking, views as highly harmful. But one of the things we know is that that's a myth, that there's not any indication that water pipe tobacco smoking is actually less addictive or safer than cigarettes. In fact, one of the things we find is that among teenagers, smoking hookah leads to addiction quicker than smoking cigarettes. So I want to then present some of the studies that my colleagues and I have done. So I've just numbered them for convenience sake. So the first study that we did several years ago and eventually got published is to go ahead and look at what are the distributions of people's perceptions of risk and worry about harm and addiction. And we looked at this in 3 separate samples. 2 samples are non-smokers. One of those is what are called susceptible non-smokers. These are people who don't smoke hookah, but yet are open to trying it, or people who are not susceptible, which means they have no interest in trying the product, and smokers. So let me go ahead and present to you the study design. It's pretty straightforward. What we did is we recruited participants who we considered young adults between the ages of 18 and 30, and they went ahead and completed an online survey using Turk Prime. So these are people who go online and get paid to do studies. And so we got smokers and non-smokers or non-users. And what we did is we asked them questions about their perceived risk and worry, both for harm as well as addiction, as well as several other beliefs, which I'm only going to present some. And then we also asked non-users to fill out measures of curiosity and willingness to smoke tobacco. In other words, issues that are related to your susceptibility to use. So these are the 4 items we assessed to capture susceptibility. My colleagues and I developed some of these items, and we found that prospectively that people who answered anything other than definitely no to any of these 4 questions were about 2 to 3 times more likely to end up being a smoker 1 year when they completed these measures. So we feel that this is a good measure of susceptibility. It's also based on some of the work that John Pierce has done with susceptibility to cigarettes. And here's an idea of the measures. And by the way, a lot of the measures and methods that I'm going to be presenting are very similar. But what do you think is your chance of getting a serious disease, such as cancer, lung disease, and so forth, if you don't quit? How much do you worry about getting these diseases? And if you were a non-smoker, what we asked is, think of yourself actually engaging in the habit of smoking. How would you answer these questions in that hypothetical situation? And then we asked very similar questions about the idea of becoming addicted to hookah, tobacco smoking. So I'm going to present one chart about the characteristics of the sample, and that's the only study I'm going to present characteristics, because most of the time what we find are demographic characteristics that are similar to this. But what we find in general, and this is important in terms of frequency of use for among those who smoke, is that it's not a product that's used like vaping or cigarettes, where a lot of people engage in it weekly. It's a product that it's done occasionally during a month, so maybe once a month, or it's something that people do weekly, so maybe once a week, 3 times a week, and so forth and so on. But unlike other tobacco-related products, it's not necessarily a product that is used often, and that in part may be a reason why people think they're not at risk, because they get this impression that they're not doing it enough to really harm themselves. But here's what I wanted to show, which I think is the important point, because this launched a series of studies. So if you go ahead and combine the measures of perceived risk and worry for harm and addiction, where the higher scores represent greater risk. And by the way, if you did this on the factor analysis, you find that these items load pretty heavily with each other, is that non-susceptibles on average seem to say hookah is really harmful. And then if you look at susceptibles, which again are people who aren't using the product but are open to trying it, they fit somewhere in the middle. And then if you're a smoker, you tend to downplay the risks the most, which is a common theme you find among people who use different types of tobacco products. So that really set the stage to say, susceptibles, and especially smokers, are really individuals who are a group that needs to be targeted to try to elevate their perceptions of risk. And the reason we want to do that is because theoretically, if you think you're at greater harm for yourself, you should either not engage in the activity itself, or if you're engaged in the activity, quit so you don't harm yourself. So study 2 was really concerned about this notion of, well, can we actually affect these perceptions of harm? And so what we did is we created some very brief messages about harm. And what we wanted to look at in particular was, do brief messages about harm versus brief messages about harm and plus addiction influence some of those risk measures that we talked about earlier? And also, does it influence the desire to quit? So what we did was a 3-arm study using the same technique I mentioned earlier. And we had 3 conditions to this study. One is we provided people with no information whatsoever. So that was our control group. All they did was answer questions online. The second group, we provided some information about the harms of water pipe tobacco only. And the third group, we added harms or information about the addictiveness of water pipe tobacco to the harm messages. So what I want to do now is actually present some of the messaging that we used for the presentation. Again, these were PowerPoint slides. They weren't, you know, fancy in any way, shape, or form. It's just trying to get the facts out. So what we said to people is that hookah tobacco smoking is really associated with a variety of different bad health events. And we mentioned, as you can see here, all the various kinds of illnesses that could be associated with hookah tobacco smoking, certainly at a more regular level. And then what we also said to people is, if you share the mouthpiece, and this is the mouthpiece with other people, you have the potential of spreading these various infections to other people and diseases to other people. So that was one part of the information. Then the other thing that we informed people is, here are some of the chemicals that are found in water pipe tobacco smoke. To make them understand what these chemicals are, we told them that these compounds are found in these common products. So for example, naphthalene is found in the creation of mothballs. And then we gave them a ratio of how much more this particular chemical is found in hookah smoke compared to cigarettes. And as you can see here, hookah smoke contains more of these chemicals than cigarettes. Then what we did is we also went ahead and talked about addiction. So those were the two brief messages of harm. Then we talked about addiction. So I'll let you read this, but you know, the basic idea is, well, what evidence exists that water pipe tobacco is actually addictive? And we provided some evidence to suggest that, you know, for example, a quote at the very bottom. And then the other thing that we did is we went ahead and actually showed them what the data suggests in terms of amount of addiction, but amount of nicotine found in water pipe tobacco smoke, and how does that translate to the amount of nicotine found in cigarettes, and to what extent is it addictive? So what we emphasized the most, as you can see, is in red. And at the end, we try to make a conclusion statement that says data support that water pipe tobacco is actually an addictive product. So again, we ask people these questions about perceived risk, perceived harm, worry, and so forth. And what we did is we went ahead and averaged these items. Okay, so we averaged worry here and here. Then again, we ask questions about perceived risk and worry about addiction using the same kind of format. So I'm going to go and present the data next, but I'll ask you folks, how many of you think that adding messages about addiction actually enhance perceptions of risk and worry?
I think so.
Okay, so Ed thinks so. Does anybody else want to put a vote? Nicole, you did? Okay. Randy, what do you think?
I think it would.
You think you would? Okay. Well, let's see if you win. Amir, what do you think?
I said, I think it would.
Oh, you would? Okay. All right. So
Yes.
Let me see if you're right. So here's the control condition where they didn't get any information. Here's the one they looked at harm only. And then when we added about addiction. So these go from 1 to 7, where higher scores represent higher risk and worry and desire to quit. So one of the things that we found is that harm only messages on average, so those two small slides of information actually did increase perceptions of risk. Not hugely, but it did serve its purpose. And then here's what happens when you add those addiction messages to the very end. It didn't do anything. I mean, in terms of being even better than the harm only messages. So the good thing is giving people the information about harm only or harm and addiction actually did increase perceptions of harms and worry and so forth, and desire to quit, but they didn't do it more so than just presenting questions of information about harm. So, which kind of boggles the mind, right? And you could ask, well, why is it that addiction messages were more potent in actually increasing the perceptions of harm? And, you know, my colleagues and I have tried to answer this, and other people have. And it could be that the reason people don't concern themselves about addiction is because number one, I think they have this notion that, well, you've got to do it quite often before you ever become addicted. And I think the perception in youth is that, well, I'm not going to do it that often. And because I'm not going to do it that often, I'm not necessarily going to become addicted. So I don't think that information, though relevant and useful, doesn't necessarily apply to me. And the other thing, and some of you who do work in addiction might say, well, maybe addiction in and of itself is kind of an elusive concept. You know, it's notions about losing control, seeking out stimuli that provide you with the addictive substance, you know, doing things when you're falling and you're ill and so forth and so on. And maybe people just don't comprehend fully what it means to be addicted. So maybe from that perspective, because it's an abstract concept, people don't necessarily think of it as all that persuasive in terms of affecting their perceptions of harm, and then ultimately striving for them to change their behaviors in any way. Okay, so we did a third study. So let me go ahead and talk about this third study. And so the primary question that we asked here about this particular topic was, let's look at non-smokers who are susceptible or not. And the reason we wanted to focus now on those groups of individuals is because our very earlier data, and that slide that I showed you, suggested that non-smokers who are not susceptible really think that this product is harmful and addictive, but those who are susceptible don't perceive it as much that way. All right, they're more inclined to view it as a safer product. So the real issue is then, can we affect perceptions of harm, especially targeting those who are susceptible, and does it affect future intentions? So we got this data published, and the general prediction we made is that if you're a non-smoker who's not susceptible, what data we present isn't going to move you very much because you already think it's bad. But among people who are susceptible, we think that providing information would be bad. And therefore, they would change their perceptions. So what we did is we went ahead and we did a study again that used this Turk prime kind of ideology, same age group between those around the ages of 18 to 30. And they completed online studies. And here's just some indication that we reached the sample roughly 50% male, 80% white. And what we did is use that 4-item measure of susceptibility that I presented earlier, and we stratified people on whether they were susceptible or not. And then we randomized them based on that stratification variable to a no information control group, which means all they did was complete survey items, questionnaire items. Or what we did is we presented that information about harms and addictiveness that I just presented to you in our second study. So let me go ahead and talk about our measures. We try to get a little bit more comprehensive set of measures about their attitudes about smoking hookah. So positive, negative, like, dislike, etc. And we averaged all those together, and the scores went from 3 to -3. So a negative value represents a more negative attitude towards smoking hookah. We also asked people how conflicted they are about smoking hookah. And the reason we think ambivalence is really important is because it's an extension of how strong you hold your attitudes. But it so happens that a lot of people who use tobacco to some degree feel conflicted about it. So if you talk to smokers, for example, and you say, do you ever feel conflicted about smoking? What you'll find is that a fair number of them actually feel conflicted. And the reason that's important is because if you are more ambivalent, hence conflicted, you may be more open-minded to messages that make you reduce that sense of conflict in one direction or the other. We also ask questions about social acceptability. The reason we did that is we know that people are more likely to use a product if they feel their peers are more likely to use it, and that's clearly the case for water pipe tobacco. So social acceptability and how many people Do you think out of 100 use it? So those both metrics of how you view other people using the product. And then similar questions about willingness and curiosity to use water pipe. And here are just a couple of the questions to illustrate those concepts. So how well did we do? Well, if you look at just simply by susceptibility status, we basically replicated our earlier results. That if you're not susceptible, you tend to view yourself as more at risk and worry more about harm and addiction. We find that they hold more negative attitudes towards smoking water pipe. They're a little bit less conflicted about trying the product and using it. They view it as less socially acceptable. And also they view less people smoking the product than people who are susceptible. And also they express a really low willingness and curiosity to use it compared to susceptibles, which again are people who have not used it but are open to trying it. And then if you look at this in terms of the experimental conditions, what we find is that perceived risk and worry and global attitudes and felt ambivalence overall was higher in the experimental group than in the control group. So our intervention was overall successful, but it didn't affect things that you might think shouldn't be affected, which is social acceptability and peer use. And here, this willingness, curiosity, you might say, well, Isaac, why didn't you affect that? Well, what we actually did is get an interaction that we predicted. So what you find here, as I mentioned earlier, is we didn't suspect that people who are in the control group would be in any way, shape, or form affected by our messaging. After all, they already start off with a pretty negative evaluation of hookah tobacco smoking. So why should our messages really move them in any substantial direction? But we did think that for those who were susceptible, our messaging would actually work in making them view it as more negative and therefore more likely to express lower willingness to so forth. So what you find here is that when we give people the messages, they express a lower willingness to want to smoke it compared to susceptibles in the control group. So that was good news. The good news is that even though you're not using the product and therefore you don't have direct experience with using it, that giving people this information was useful at least discouraging them from wanting to use the product. So if you're trying to think of prevention, it seems that those messages were really potentially useful. The fourth study that I want to present is other ways of discussing about the harms of water pipe tobacco among young adults. And as I think most of you are familiar with, there's substantial research towards how do we use text warnings and especially graphic warnings to discourage, for example, cigarette use. And the thing that always bogs my mind is across the country, we don't have any regulations that say you have to use graphic warnings right now. There are regulations in other countries that say, no, you will put graphic warnings on your products, you know, like the covers of cigarette packages and so forth and so on. And what we find is that putting graphic warnings actually does do something to dissuade people from using the tobacco product. And this theme of using graphic warnings has really not been used in the area of water pipe tobacco, even though the World Health Organization says we should be using graphic warnings on water pipe tobacco, but we are not using that right now at all in hookah tobacco use. So my colleagues and I put forward a grant in R21 to start exploring what's the value of adding graphic warnings to text warnings and comparing that to no graphic warnings whatsoever or text warnings whatsoever. And we wanted to test them not on necessarily, you know, on the products, even though we did do that, but we wanted to test them on what are called social allure ads. Social allure ads, which I'll present in just a minute, are ads that are put out there to try to entice people to participate in social activities where they have the option to actually use hookah tobacco. And we wanted to see how that can actually affect their attitudes, emotional reactions, perceived harms, and desire to use the product as shown in the ads as a function of whether you got no warnings, text-only warnings, or graphic warnings. And it's important to know that we varied the themes of the ads, and we also varied the themes of the warnings, such as that we did what are called long-term, short-term toxicants and addiction. So what I want to do is I want to turn over and give you the basic design, and then I'll actually show you some of the ads, and you can tell me what you think of the ads. So the design was, again, using people on MTurk who were between the ages of 18 and 30, and they were randomized to 3 main groups. They got to see 2 ads that didn't contain any warnings whatsoever, but may vary the theme, and I'll talk about the theme in just a minute. They could see 2 ads that varied the theme, and they had on them a text warning only, where it represented the domains of health, such as long-term effects, short-term effects, toxicants, and addiction, etc. And then they got the same thing as the second group, only there was a graphic that was added to it that helped to illustrate what the text warning was trying to display. So let me talk to you about the ads that we used. We used a total of about 64 ads, so these are just examples of the various ads. So one of the ads we called is what's called social acceptance. Social acceptance is when people gather together to socialize, really, and use a hookup. So this is an example of happy hour. People get together and they socialize. Then there's an ad what we called occasion appropriate. Occasion appropriate is when people use hookah on specific events. So for example, here, Valentine's Day or New Year's Day or 4th of July and so forth and so on. The idea is you're associating the use of the hookah with a particular holiday or special event. It could be a person's birthday also as well. Then we have ads that are called erotic and exotic ads. So erotic ads try to show eroticism. So usually the picture of people who are very sexy and so forth. Or what are called exotic ads. Exotic ads tend to emphasize more the cultural aspects of hookah use, like belly dancing and so forth. All these ads, by the way, are real ads that we were able to get. So what they were actually evaluating and seeing were actual ads that have been used in the past. So what I want to do now is just show you an example of our warnings and how it looked on an ad. So I'm going to use this on the exotic ads. So all the following examples are for exotic ads. So we said here, hookah smoke contains cancer-causing chemicals. Same thing here, only we add the picture of, oh, this should have been cancer-causing chemicals with this as a toxic. So this gives you some idea of that. Here's long-term health effects. So here's lung cancer. And here's a picture of a diseased lung. Again, when I was really young, they showed us a picture of a diseased lung and people said, well, how does that make you feel about smoking? And the general idea of everybody was, God, that's gross. We don't ever want to see that happening inside ourselves. And the question is, does this really work, with adults and younger adults? Here we had about carbon monoxide poisoning. So this is, again, the toxicant kind of thing. So we show here in this graphic a person who's on the floor, apparently unconscious with, the smoke that contains carbon monoxide. And the last one is on addiction, where we say it's just as addictive as cigarettes. And what we show here is a slide with the hookah rope, whatever you want to call this, straddling the person's neck, trying to illustrate lack of control, that it's controlling it. Okay, so what did we do in terms of assessing some of the main reactions to these ads and warnings? Well, what we did is we asked about their attitudes. These attitudes consisted of all these items, which we averaged together. We did, by the way, ask questions that capture the cognitive elements of attitudes as well as their emotional attitudes towards it. And this was on 7-point Likert scales. They're bipolar, but on 7 points. Your emotional reactions was, how did the ad make you feel? Using all of that, all of these items below, worried and so forth. Again, they were bipolar. Perceived message effectiveness was our measure of perceived risk. And it's a useful tool because people use items assessing message effectiveness as a indicator of which types of ads to explore further in research. So we went ahead and used that. And then our two main outcomes were, to what extent you want to participate in that activity. So remember, we had erotic, exotic, occasion appropriate, and social acceptance ads. To what extent would you want to be engaged in any of this? Seeing erotic dancers or exotic dancers, or meeting with people socially, or smoking it during an event. And then again, we asked the question, to what extent did the ad affect the extent to which you want to smoke the product from it reduced to increased mind desire? So here's my question to you. Do you think our warnings did better than not presenting any warnings whatsoever?
Yes.
Yes. Anybody else wants to venture a guess counter to that?
I think yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, you were correct. So this is combining smokers and susceptible non-smokers. They really didn't differ all that much from each other. We got few interactions between smoking status. So again, we use smokers and susceptible non-smokers because we want to see if we could prevent them from using the product. So if you look at the attitudes, we got an emotions and perceived risk and desire to smoke. We get this very nice linear trend that as you get from ads only to adding graphics to the text warnings, you see that things become more negative, right? So they have more negative attitudes, they experience more negative emotions, they perceive them messages as being more effective, the ads being more effective at discouraging use. And what we want here is a decline in their desire to want to use the product, and that's exactly what we see. So this nice linear trend was what we were expecting, and that's exactly what we found. Then the outcome in terms of would you ever participate in the activity, we found that that actually did result in an interaction between smokers and susceptibles. And what we find is that for smokers, in the ads only, they expressed a higher level of wanting to participate in the activity that was shown in the ad. In other words, whatever the thing the ad was showing. And what we find here, though, is that adding graphic warnings to text messages didn't necessarily make it more effective than text only. And then for non-smokers, we find that it didn't matter that for those susceptible non-smokers, they just had a negative attitude, overall orientation about their willingness to participate in that activity. So we're finding that at least willingness to engage in the activities was decreased for smokers when you gave them some sort of warning compared to nothing, and that for non-smokers, those who were susceptible, it didn't really matter in this case. All right, so I just want to summarize then what our findings have shown today and talk a little bit about the future directions, and then open it up to give you some ample time to answer or ask me some questions. So what we've shown in terms of our program of research, and again, this is just a snippet of some of the findings from our research program, is that if you could give people brief messages, it does influence their perceptions of risk and their motivation to use the product. And it's not only through those PowerPoint messaging that were brief, but also these health warnings on the ads. And by the way, we also use product ads as well. Those are things like showing them flavored tobacco as well as hookah apparatus, and we're finding the same trends there. And the other thing, which I think is really important, is that for the most part, a lot of the effects that we find are both for smokers and for that group who's at high risk, which are these susceptible non-smokers, which I think is a really important target. So with that, I just want to acknowledge my big slew of colleagues who really have been extremely helpful and valuable in giving me insights in terms of the direction of our research, and certainly refining and making the research that my colleagues and I are doing better. And of course, I want to thank the R21. So with that, I thought I'd stop sharing and see if you had any questions about some of the research we're doing or hookah in general.
Well, thank you, Isaac. That was a great presentation of your research and an important area. I was just wondering, in terms of the social aspects of hookah smoking, over the last year or more, we've learned a lot about contagious disease. But if you would look at addiction and hookah in particular as possibly a contagion, not in terms of getting sharing a mouthpiece, but the actual participation in hookah smoking. So have you, or is the literature have examples of people looking at how it's spread from person to person, how people were initiated, and how people could be de-initiated through the kind of the social network?
Yeah. Well, first of all, so if you're talking about spread, for example, of diseases and so forth, the one thing that we did collect data on was, because it is a social event, right? People gather together and do it. We did ask in our very last study, how has the COVID epidemic affected your use of smoking hookah with other people? And what we found is it basically didn't do anything. It was a beautiful normal distribution. I mean, really beautiful. The endpoints was never, none of the time to always. And what we found is that most of the people said somewhat often or always during that. Now, in terms of social network analysis, like doing like a classic, who do you talk to and so forth and so on, there hasn't been any interventions that have done that. There is some research that suggests that people do talk about some of the risk messages to other people, and that's a way of translating the health risks. But there hasn't been really any detailed information at all talking about people's perceptions about the spread, how, when is that most likely to be the case when people get infected, how many people do you need to share it with, and so forth and so on.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, when I was in grad school, it wasn't tobacco in the hookah. So I wonder if you know the prevalence of marijuana versus tobacco in hookah use among, the typical college age youth population today.
Yeah, I don't recall I know what you're getting at. I don't recall what the latest statistics were, but I think it's something like about 5–10%. Mm-hmm. That there's this, they look at the apparatus as a way of smoking weed. But really, right now, what it's turning more into is switching from not necessarily weed, but it's smoking the tobacco and now vaping through a hookah. Mm-hmm. So you could get liquid, the same liquid that you use for vaping in the e-cigs and put it in a hookah and vape.
That sounds really dangerous.
Yeah. So what we found in our studies is that about 40 to 50% of the people say that they not only use tobacco, but they also vape.
Oh, interesting.
So that's scary. And, the question is, well, if you vape, does it actually affect your perceptions of harm with respect to tobacco use? Mm-hmm. And that's an unknown question. We had a little bit of data that suggests that if you vaped, you viewed smoking tobacco as less dangerous.
I see. Yeah. Other questions, comments? I had a question about dual use, both in terms of hookah and traditional cigarette smoking and vaping. How prevalent is it? Are there pure hookah users, or are there substantial kind of cross use? And also the dual use of hookah and alcohol. As people are sitting around, are they also drinking? And does that
so there was one paper that I'm trying to recall that actually looked at it from national sample. And I think what you generally find is that about maybe 25% to a third of the population just exclusively use hookah. Mm-hmm. And the rest is with some other alternative tobacco product. And what by that I mean not only cigarettes, but vaping and snuff, all sorts of different things. So yeah, and in terms of alcohol use, it is, but I don't know what the combination between those are specifically. But yes, in fact, one of the problems with hookah is that sometimes, and there's data to support this, is that it's used as a gateway product to, for example, smoking cigarettes and other products.
I see. Yeah.
So one of the things you find, for example, even though I talked about susceptibility to hookah use, if you're susceptible to hookah use, you're also susceptible to using other tobacco products as well. So there may be this huge umbrella of just general susceptibility to a particular product, you know, that falls under issues about either combustible products to want to use those.
Uh-huh. And what about the strategy of, you know, I know that in terms of danger and harm, messages are usually kind of medical harm, you know, cancer or other sorts of diseases. But what about the social harm of people, you know, don't do this, you'll stink, or nobody's going to want to kiss you, or, you know, the things that are kind of more at the top of the list of concerns of adolescents and young adults.
Yeah, they don't usually say that as a particular deficit.
Oh, okay.
So what we've asked people in the past is, well, why do you smoke hookah? Yeah. And what people will say is, well, it reduces my stress. Mm-hmm. It tastes good. It allows me to socialize. Mm-hmm. Those are very common reasons that people do say they want to use, you know, makes me feel good. It makes me feel relaxed. Those are the common reasons that people say that. If you say to people, why don't you want to use it? The most common reason is because it's bad for you. And what they mention tends to be the medical harms you've mentioned. Mm-hmm. Occasionally, they'll say, well, I don't want to be hurting my kids, or I don't want to be hurting somebody else. You know, occasionally it stinks. Yeah. You know, but that tends not to be the most prevalent answer in terms of how it socially may affect other people.
Okay, great. Any other questions, comments? Okay, well, I want to thank you again, Isaac, for a great presentation and bringing to a close our spring semester of talks. And again, I wanted to remind people we're going to reconvene on August 25th with Chang-San Lee from Yale about cocaine craving, and then Jennifer Rinker on the following week, September 1st, from Medical University of South Carolina, talking about the frontal cortex and relationships to the thalamus and alcohol. And then continuing on. Believe it or not, I'm starting to put together the spring of 2022 seminar schedule. So if you have any suggestions or desire to present yourself, please contact me, and have a great summer. And
yeah, thanks everybody. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And if you ever want to dare to even collaborate with me, let me know as well. I'm always open to new ideas.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you. Bye-bye.